In 1958, the Rank Organization, a British conglomerate whose primary interests lay in cinema chains, hotel management, and the manufacture of photocopiers, purchased Wharfedale Wireless Works of Idle, Bradford, West Yorkshire. There was no announcement in the national press, no valediction from the music trade journals. Just a change of ownership, a change of letterhead, and a Yorkshire engineer who stayed on as an employee of a company he had built from nothing over 26 years. The price paid for Wharfedale Wireless Works was not recorded in the sources that survive. What was recorded 5 years earlier was something rather different. In 1954, Gilbert Briggs had booked the Royal Festival Hall, the great post-war concert hall on the South Bank, built for the Festival of Britain, and not yet 4 years old. He booked it for a single evening. The event sold out in 4 days. 3,000 people came to sit in the dark and listen to a curtain. Behind that curtain on one side were live musicians. On the other side were loudspeakers built not in a laboratory, not by a government-funded research program, but in a factory in West Yorkshire by workers who had come up through the textile trades of the Wharfe Valley. When the curtain fell at the end of the evening, many in the audience could not say with certainty which side they had been hearing. Britain had just proved something. Then, 4 years later, it sold the proof. The story of Wharfedale is not the story of a company that failed. It is the story of a standard set in a cellar in a market town in Yorkshire by a man with no capital and no formal technical training, and what Britain chose to do with that standard once it became valuable. What does it mean to sell the standard, not the product? The standard itself. The demonstration conducted on the stage of the Royal Festival Hall before 3,000 witnesses that a living room in Bradford could sound like a concert hall in London, and that this had been achieved not by a corporation, not by a laboratory, but by a man who had learned to wind a voice coil in his own cellar in the valley of the River Wharfe in the winter of 1932. If you care about where sound comes from, not just the music, but the objects that made it possible, this channel is for you. Subscribe and stay with us. There is a great deal more of this story still to tell. Gilbert Arthur Briggs was born on the 29th of December 1890 in Bradford, West Yorkshire. His father was Phineas Briggs, a mill worker descended from a line of Yorkshire weavers. Phineas died of pleuropneumonia when Gilbert was 9 years old, leaving 4 young children to be raised by their mother in a back-to-back terrace house in one of the most industrially dense cities in England. There was no inheritance, there was no safety net. There was the mill and the loom, and the particular discipline that the West Riding textile trade demanded of everyone who worked within it, precision patience, and a tolerance for repetitive labor performed to exacting standards. Briggs spent 27 years in that trade. By the time the Great Depression arrived in Britain in the early 1930s, the Bradford textile industry, already contracting under competition from cheaper overseas production, had all but destroyed the economic security of those who depended on it. Briggs was among them. He was in his early 40s, virtually bankrupted with no obvious path forward. He had no relevant formal training in electronics or acoustics. What he had was a passion for music, a passion precise enough that at the age of 18 he had saved for 3 years to purchase his first piano, and a growing specific frustration with what wireless sets of the period actually sounded like. That frustration was the founding condition of Wharfedale. The problem was not difficult to state. A wireless set of the early 1930s reproduced the human voice with reasonable adequacy. It did not reproduce music. The frequency range required to convey the full character of a piano, a violin, a brass section, or a choir was far wider than any domestic loudspeaker of the period was designed to handle. The compromise was accepted because it was universal. Briggs did not accept it. His house stood in Ilkley, a market town in the valley of the River Wharfe, a river that runs east from the Pennines through the West Riding of Yorkshire, giving its name to the dale it carves Wharfedale. The town itself was modest, prosperous by the standards of the surrounding mill towns set against the backdrop of Ilkley Moor to the south. It was not a place associated with technological innovation. It was a place associated with wool with water and with the particular stoicism of the West Riding character qualities that would, as it turned out, prove entirely suited to the work Briggs was about to undertake. In 1932, in the cellar of that house, he built his first loudspeaker. The construction was entirely manual. A cone of paper shaped to move air, when driven by a voice, coil a tightly wound coil of copper wire suspended in a magnetic gap that translates electrical signal into mechanical movement. When electrical current from a wireless amplifier passes through the coil moves, the cone moves with it, and the air in the room moves in response. That movement, if the cone is correctly shaped and the coil correctly wound, produces sound. Briggs wound the coil himself. His wife, Doris Edna Briggs, assembled the components, soldering connections, winding coils late into the evening, functioning as the entire production department of what did not yet have a name. The result sounded better than anything in the room that had preceded it. Briggs built another, then another. In 1933, he entered 2 of his loudspeaker units into the Bradford Radio Society's annual competition, a gathering of the serious amateur electronics enthusiasts who formed the most technically literate audience available to him in the West Riding. He won both first and second place. The bronze model, as it was designated, generated sufficient interest among the membership that Wharfedale received its first substantial commercial order shortly afterward. Briggs moved into a small factory near Bradford. The company was no longer a cellar operation. It was, in the specific British idiom of the period, a going concern. The name came from the valley. Wharfedale Wireless Works, a name that carried in its 4 syllables both the geography of its origin and the technology of its moment. Wireless was the medium. The Wharf Valley was the place. The works was everything Briggs and Doris had built between them with their hands in a cellar from a frustration that most people of their generation had simply learned to live with. By 1939, the year Britain went to war, Wharfedale Wireless Works was producing approximately 9,000 loudspeaker units per year. It had grown from 2 people in a cellar to a functioning small factory in less than a decade. That rate of growth from those particular beginnings in that particular valley was not an accident of timing or market conditions. It was the consequence of a product that from the first sounded better than its competition, because its maker had a standard in mind that none of his competitors had yet articulated. That standard was simple. It was also in 1932 essentially impossible to achieve. Gilbert Briggs wanted a loudspeaker that sounded like live music, not approximately like live music. Not like live music through a wall or across a street or at the far end of a large hall. Like live music in a room. He would spend the next 22 years finding out whether it was possible. When war came in September 1939, Wharfedale did not stop. It changed. The factory had already moved to larger premises in Brighouse, a mill town between Bradford and Huddersfield, in anticipation of the increased demand that the pre-war years had generated. The conflict brought a different kind of demand entirely. Wharfedale was commissioned to produce transformers for Marconi, the company whose wireless technology had done more than any other to create the market for loudspeakers in the first place. In the second half of the war, a team of 20 people in the Brighouse factory built approximately 40,000 transformer units for Marconi's communication equipment. 40,000 units, 20 people. The production discipline that the Bradford textile trade had spent a century developing precision consistency. Tolerance turned out to be exactly what military electronics manufacturing required. When the war ended, Wharfedale moved again. this time to idle a village on the northern edge of Bradford, close enough to the city's industrial infrastructure to draw on its workforce, and supply chains far enough from the city center to have room to grow. The idle factory would become the address most closely associated with the brand's peak years. It would also eventually be the address from which the brand's British identity departed. But in 1945, the future was not contraction. It was expansion into a world that had, during 6 years of conflict, developed an entirely new relationship with sound. The war had equipped an entire generation of men and women with experience of high-quality audio reproduction military radio systems, broadcast equipment, the cinema sound technology that had accompanied the newsreels and propaganda films of the conflict. When those men and women returned to civilian life, the standard domestic wireless set felt inadequate, in a way it had not felt inadequate before. They had heard better. They wanted better. In the United States, this appetite was already generating a nascent, high-fidelity movement, a term coined in the American trade press to describe audio reproduction that prioritized accuracy over convenience. In Britain, the appetite was equally present, but the equipment to satisfy it was not. Wharfedale was positioned to fill that gap. In 1945, the company introduced its first domestic two-way loudspeaker system. The term requires a definition. A two-way loudspeaker uses two separate drive units, a larger woofer responsible for bass and mid-frequencies, and a smaller tweeter responsible for the upper frequency range connected by a crossover network, a passive electronic circuit that divides the incoming signal and routes each frequency band to the appropriate driver. The result is a speaker capable of reproducing a far wider range of frequencies than any single drive unit can manage alone. Two-way systems had existed before, in cinemas, in theaters, in broadcast studios, but they had been large, expensive, and immovable. Wharfedale's 1945 design was intended for a domestic living room. The external crossover unit required 2 people to lift it. The speaker cabinet itself was substantial by any modern standard, but it worked, and it worked in a way that nothing previously available to a British domestic listener had worked. It reproduced the frequency range of a full musical performance with a coherence and accuracy that the single-driver wireless sets of the 1930s had been constitutionally incapable of delivering. Wharfedale had not invented the two-way loudspeaker. It had made it domestic. That distinction would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. In 1948, Briggs published his first book. Its title was direct and functional, in the manner of a man who had no patience for obscurity, Loudspeakers, the Why and How of Good Reproduction. The first edition sold out within 5 months. It was reprinted multiple times. Over the following 19 years, Briggs would write 21 books on audio and loudspeaker design published through Wharfedale, selling in total well over 250,000 copies worldwide. They were written not for engineers, but for listeners, for the person who wanted to understand why their wireless set sounded the way it did and what could be done about it. They were models of clear technical writing, precise, without being academic opinionated, without being polemical. 250,000 copies in the British publishing market of the post-war decades represented something considerably more than commercial success. It represented a readership, a community of serious listeners spread across Britain and beyond who had been educated in the principles of audio reproduction by the same man who was making the loudspeakers they were evaluating. No other British audio manufacturer had anything equivalent. Briggs had not merely built a product. He had built an audience for it. The factory in Idle grew steadily through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The workforce expanded. The product range widened. Wharfedale's reputation in the British hi-fi trade, still a small specialist sector, served by a handful of dedicated retailers, and a growing music press became the closest thing the industry had to an established standard. Raymond Cook, a young engineer who would go on to found one of the most significant loudspeaker companies in British history, joined Wharfedale during this period. He came to take the technical design work off Briggs's hands. What he found, as he later described it, was a company with a high reputation and a straightforward product philosophy, conventional in its engineering, exceptional in its execution, and run by a man who understood with unusual clarity that the purpose of a loudspeaker was not to impress an engineer. It was to convince a listener. How did a textile valley in West Yorkshire, a place built on wool and weaving on the machinery of an older industrial Britain, become the center of something as new and strange as high-fidelity sound? The answer, in the case of Wharfedale, is that it did not happen despite the textile valley. It happened because of it. The precision, the patience, the tolerance for exacting repetitive work, these were not incidental qualities that Briggs happened to possess. They were the specific inheritance of the West Riding working culture applied to a problem that the culture had not previously considered. The valley had always made things carefully. Gilbert Briggs had simply found a new thing to make. The question that Gilbert Briggs had been working toward since 1932 was not, strictly speaking, a technical question. It was a philosophical one dressed in technical clothing. Could a loudspeaker, a mechanical object, a cone of paper, driven by copper wire in a magnetic field, reproduce the sound of a live musical performance with sufficient accuracy that a trained human ear could not reliably distinguish between the two, not approximately? Not close enough for casual listening, close enough to fool a concert audience in a concert hall under controlled conditions with musicians present on the same stage. Most engineers of the period would have said no. Not because the physics was impossible, but because the gap between what the best available equipment could do and what a live performance actually sounded like was by any reasonable measurement enormous. The frequency range of a full orchestra extends from the lowest notes of a double bass, around 40 cycles per second, to the highest overtones of a violin or piccolo, above 15,000 cycles per second. Reproducing that range at realistic volume levels with the dynamic variation of a live performance through a loudspeaker, small enough to fit in a domestic room, was considered by the professional audio community to be a distant aspiration rather than an achievable near-term goal. Briggs did not approach it as a distant aspiration. He approached it as a design brief. By the early 1950s, the Wharfedale product range had evolved significantly from the first cellar experiments of 1932. The drive units, the electromechanical components at the heart of each loudspeaker, comprising the cone, the voice coil, the magnet assembly, and the basket frame that holds them in alignment, were designed and built in idle to tolerances that the British manufacturing trade of the period recognized as exceptional. The cabinets were substantial, often sand-filled between inner and outer walls, sand being one of the most effective and economical materials available for absorbing the resonant vibrations that an inadequate cabinet would otherwise add to the sound. The crossover networks were carefully designed to ensure that the transition between drive units was acoustically smooth, that the listener heard a single coherent sound, not two separate drivers working in parallel. Raymond Cook, who had joined to manage the technical design work, later described the flagship three-way corner enclosure of the period as something that really worked very well. In the specific language of a British engineer, this was high praise. The corner enclosure, a speaker cabinet designed to sit in the corner of a room using the two walls and the floor as acoustic extensions of the cabinet itself, was a Wharfedale speciality of the early 1950s. It allowed bass extension that a freestanding cabinet of equivalent size could not achieve, and it placed the loudspeaker in the position within a domestic room where its radiation pattern was most evenly distributed. It was not a glamorous solution. It was a correct one. But the product, however well designed, was not the breakthrough. The breakthrough was the demonstration. In the early 1950s, Briggs began staging what he called live versus recorded concerts, public events, at which an audience would hear live musical performances and recorded playback through Wharfedale loudspeakers and would be invited to judge whether they could tell the difference. The format was simple and the conditions were controlled. Musicians performed behind a curtain. The loudspeakers were positioned on the other side of the same curtain. The audience heard sound. They could not see its source. When the curtain was raised at the end of the demonstration, the source was revealed. The question that preceded the revelation was the same at every event, which was which? The first demonstrations were staged in smaller venues, a university hall in Canada, St. George's Hall, in Bradford Hotel ballrooms, and civic theatres across the north of England. Each event generated correspondence word of mouth and a growing reputation in the British hi-fi trade press. By 1954, the reputation was sufficient for Briggs to attempt something considerably more ambitious. He booked the Royal Festival Hall. The Festival Hall had opened in 1951 as the centerpiece of the Festival of Britain, a vast modernist concert hall on the south bank of the Thames designed to seat 3,000 people and to serve as the principal home of the London Philharmonic Orchestra. It was not a venue that had previously been used for trade demonstrations. It was a venue associated with Beethoven, with Brahms, with the full weight of the classical concert tradition. Booking it for a loudspeaker demonstration required either considerable confidence or considerable audacity. Briggs possessed both in roughly equal measure. The event sold out in 4 days. On the night, the format was the same as it had always been. Live musicians. Wharfedale loudspeakers driven by quad amplification Peter Walker's company providing the electronics, while Briggs provided the transducers. A curtain drawn across the stage. An audience of 3,000 people, many of them trained musicians, music critics, and audio engineers, seated in the dark and asked to listen without visual cues. A Wharfedale loudspeaker built from paper cones, copper wire, and ceramic magnets in a factory in Idle-West Yorkshire had reproduced the sound of a live string quartet in the Royal Festival Hall with sufficient accuracy that 3,000 people, many of them trained musicians, could not consistently identify which side of the curtain they were hearing, not because the loudspeaker was perfect, because it was good enough. And in 1954, nothing else in a British living room had ever come close. The tour continued. In the mid-1950s, Briggs and Walker took the demonstration to Carnegie Hall in New York, one of the most acoustically demanding and symbolically significant concert venues in the world. The American hi-fi press covered the event extensively. The British trade press reported its success. Hi-Fi News and Record Review Writing in 1958 described the cumulative significance of the demonstration series as events that had redefined what a domestic loudspeaker was capable of achieving. The effect on Wharfedale's commercial position was immediate and durable. The company was no longer simply a respected British loudspeaker manufacturer. It was the company that had stood on the stage of the Royal Festival Hall and asked 3,000 people whether they could hear the difference and had walked away from the evening with the answer it needed. Raymond Cook, reflecting on the period shortly before his death in 1995, described what Briggs had understood that his competitors had not. Every proposition, every product, every public act of the company was examined from a single point of view. How does it look from outside? The demonstrations were not merely marketing. They were evidence. Evidence gathered in public under controlled conditions before the most demanding available audience that the standard Briggs had set in a cellar in 1932 had been reached. He had set out to make a loudspeaker that sounded like live music in a room. In the Royal Festival Hall in 1954, before 3,000 witnesses, he had come close enough that the witnesses could not agree on the difference. What happened next would take another 4 years to arrive. But it was already, in a sense, decided. The company that had just proved its standard to the world was about to be acquired by a company whose business was something else entirely. In the autumn of 1958, Gilbert Briggs retired from the public stage of British hi-fi, not yet from Wharfedale, where he would continue working until the mid-1960s, but from the role of protagonist. The Royal Festival Hall demonstrations were behind him. The books were written and selling. The factory in Idle was producing at a scale that would have been unimaginable to the man who had wound voice coils by hand in a cellar 26 years earlier. He had handed the technical design work to Raymond Cook. He had handed the company itself by sale to the Rank organization. What Rank had acquired was not merely a profitable loudspeaker manufacturer. It had acquired the most trusted name in British domestic audio, a brand whose reputation rested not on advertising claims or trade show spectacle, but on a public demonstration conducted before 3,000 witnesses in the greatest concert hall in London that its products did what they claimed to do. That kind of reputation is not built quickly. It is also not easily transferred. Rank, to its credit in the early years, understood this well enough to leave the Idle operation largely intact and to invest in its expansion. The investment was significant. By 1967, demand for Wharfedale products had grown to the point where the existing Idle premises could no longer accommodate it. Construction began on a new facility at Bradford Road, a purpose-built manufacturing complex of 170,000 square feet, incorporating research and development laboratories, engineering offices, and mass production lines designed to operate at a scale that no previous British loudspeaker manufacturer had attempted. The building took 7 years to complete. When it was fully operational in the mid-1970s, the Bradford Road factory was producing up to 800,000 drive units annually. 800,000 drive units in a single year. The figure requires a moment of context. Britain in the mid-1970s had approximately 19 million households. A substantial proportion of those households owned a hi-fi system of some description, a record player, a tuner, an amplifier, a pair of loudspeakers. The loudspeakers, more often than not, bore the Wharfedale name. Not exclusively Goodman's Celestion and KEF were all producing competitive British products, but with a consistency and a breadth of market coverage that no single competitor matched across all price points simultaneously. From the student's first pair of bookshelf speakers to the serious listener's floor-standing three-way system, Wharfedale had a product, and the product was made in Bradford. The workforce that made it was drawn from the same West Riding community that had supplied the textile mills for a century before. Cabinet makers, assemblers, winders and solderers, quality control inspectors who understood through accumulated experience rather than formal qualification what a correctly assembled drive unit felt like in the hand and sounded like under test. This was not a workforce that could be replicated overnight elsewhere. It was a skilled community built over decades embedded in a specific industrial geography. Its existence was one of the things Rank had purchased in 1958 without fully understanding what it had. The models that defined this peak period had names drawn from the valleys and rivers of Yorkshire. The Linton, introduced in 1965, a three-way stand-mount speaker in a substantial veneered cabinet, took its name from a village on the River Wharfe, upstream from Ilkley. The Denton, introduced around 1967, was smaller and more compact, a two-way design conceived in part with Raymond Cook's influence still present in the Idle engineering culture, intended for the flat dweller and the smaller living room, capable of a resolution and musical coherence that its modest dimensions did not suggest. The Glendale, the Kingsdale, the Dovedale, the Airedale. Each name a Yorkshire geographical feature, each product a point on the same compass quality value, and the specific British conviction that a well-made loudspeaker was not a luxury but an object of household utility, as deserving of careful engineering as anything else a working family might save to acquire. In a Lasky's store on Tottenham Court Road in the late 1960s, one of the great hi-fi retail streets of Britain, where the window displays changed with each new model season, and young men stood for hours comparing amplifiers they could not yet afford. A pair of Wharfedale Lintons occupied a position of particular authority on the demonstration shelf. They were not the most expensive speakers in the room. They were not the most exotic. They were the ones the salesman reached for when a customer wanted to understand what a loudspeaker was actually supposed to do. Wide even dispersion, the sound filling the room rather than projecting from a point. Bass extension that a speaker of that cabinet volume had no obvious right to produce. A mid-range that did not impose its character on the music passing through it, but simply allowed the music to be present in the room. That last quality, the absence of imposition, the sense that the loudspeaker was not adding its own personality to the signal, was the specific Wharfedale characteristic that Briggs had pursued since 1932, and that the idle workforce had learned to build consistently into every product that left the Bradford Road factory. It was not a quality that appeared in any specification sheet. It was a quality that revealed itself over time in a room with music that the listener knew well. It was in the precise sense the standard. By the mid-1970s, that standard was present in living rooms across Britain, across Europe, and in export markets that Rank's distribution network had opened in North America and the Far East. The Wharfedale name was on more loudspeakers in more homes than any other British manufacturer had achieved before or since. The Valley of the River Wharfe had, against all reasonable expectation, entered every living room it could reach. What it had not done, what no one at Bradford Road had yet been required to consider, was defend that position against a competitor whose production economics were fundamentally different from its own. That competitor was already building. Raymond Cook left Wharfedale because of the Rank organization. Not immediately, the departure was not a dramatic resignation or a public rupture. It was the quieter British kind, a man of exceptional ability working inside a company that had changed its nature, concluding that the thing he wanted to build could not be built there any longer. He left to start his own company in a small factory unit in Maidstone, Kent. He called it KEF, the initials of Kent Engineering, and Foundry, the industrial estate where he set up his first workbench. The founding of KEF in 1961 was, from Wharfedale's perspective, the single most consequential talent loss in the history of British loudspeaker manufacturing. Cook had been, by his own account, running Wharfedale's technical design, its advertising, its distributor relationships, and its book publishing operation by the time he departed. He had received, as he later described it, an unintended apprenticeship of extraordinary breadth. Everything Briggs had taught him, consciously or otherwise, about how to build a loudspeaker company from the ground up. He took all of it with him to Maidstone. What Cook built at KEF would within a decade challenge Wharfedale's position in precisely the market segments where Wharfedale had been strongest. The KEF product philosophy, mathematically rigorous, measurement-driven, willing to use unconventional materials and construction methods in pursuit of accuracy, was a direct evolution of the approach Cook had developed under Briggs, pushed further than the idle factory's production methods and Rank's cost parameters would have permitted. Wharfedale had trained its own most formidable successor. This is not an unusual outcome in British manufacturing. It is, however, a particularly British kind of irony. Inside the Bradford Road factory through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the production lines continued at scale. The Rank era brought genuine engineering investment alongside its management logic. Ceramic magnets, lighter and more magnetically efficient than the Alnico alloy magnets that had preceded them, were introduced to Wharfedale's drive units around 1962, extending bass performance and reducing production costs simultaneously. The rolls surround a curved, flexible edge, connecting the speaker cone to its basket frame, allowing greater cone excursion and therefore deeper bass extension without mechanical distortion, became standard across the range. Laser interferometry, introduced in the early 1980s, allowed Wharfedale's engineers to analyze the motion of a speaker cone in real time to see, rather than merely measure exactly how the cone was moving at each frequency across its operating range. These were not cosmetic improvements. They were substantive engineering advances embedded in products that continued to sell well across multiple market segments. And then, in 1981, the Diamond arrived. The Wharfedale Diamond was a small two-way loudspeaker, a cabinet of approximately 5 liters internal volume, housing a 120mm mid-bass driver with a polypropylene cone and a 19mm dome tweeter. Its dimensions were modest. Its price was lower than anything Wharfedale had previously offered at comparable performance levels. It won awards immediately from What Hi-Fi from Hi-Fi Choice, from every publication that reviewed it, because it performed at a level previously associated with speakers costing 2 and 3 times as much. It became a bestseller within its first year, and remained one for the remainder of the decade, generating successive updated versions that each extended the formula rather than departing from it. The Diamond was, by any objective measure, a triumph. It democratized the Wharfedale standard in a way that even the Denton and the Linton had not managed, bringing genuinely high-quality sound reproduction to a price point accessible to the student, the young professional, the first-time buyer furnishing a flat rather than a house. Across Britain in the 1980s, the Diamond sat on thousands of shelves that the Linton would never have reached. It was the loudspeaker that most completely fulfilled Gilbert Briggs's original aspiration to put serious sound reproduction in ordinary rooms for ordinary listeners at a price that ordinary incomes could sustain. But the Diamond was also a symptom. Its success depended on cost management on polypropylene, rather than paper on a smaller cabinet requiring less timber and less labor on production efficiencies that the Bradford Road facility's scale made possible, but that pointed in their logic toward a manufacturing model that the Bradford Road facility would eventually be unable to provide competitively. The Japanese loudspeaker manufacturers Yamaha, Sony, Pioneer were by the early 1980s producing budget speakers at retail prices that the Bradford Road factory's wage structure and overhead costs made difficult to match. The Diamond was Wharfedale's answer to that pressure. It was a good answer. It was also a concession that the pressure existed. By the end of the decade, production volumes at Bradford Road remained substantial. The Wharfedale name was still on more British loudspeakers than any competitor. The Diamond series was winning awards in each successive iteration. The brand's position in the British market appeared to a casual observer entirely secure. If a loudspeaker factory in Idlewest, Yorkshire could produce 800,000 drive units in a single year and place the Wharfedale name in every bracket of the British domestic market, what exactly was it that the rank organization had failed to protect? The answer was not in the production figures. It was not in the award citations. It was in a boardroom consideration that had nothing to do with loudspeakers at all, and it was already by the late 1980s beginning to take shape. The rank organization had never been a company that understood loudspeakers. It understood audiences, the cinema audiences who filled its Odeon and Gaumont screens across Britain, the business customers who leased its rank Xerox photocopiers, the hotel guests who occupied its hospitality properties. These were businesses governed by volume, by throughput, by the logic of scale applied to a standardized product delivered to a mass market. Loudspeakers at the level Wharfedale had always operated were not that. They were the product of a specific craft culture sustained by a specific skilled workforce in a specific geographical community building to a standard that could not be reduced to a specification sheet without losing the thing that made the standard worth having. Rank did not destroy Wharfedale. That distinction matters and must be stated plainly. Under Rank's ownership, the Bradford Road factory was built. The Linton and the Denton were developed. The ceramic magnet and the roll surround were introduced. The Diamond was launched. These were real achievements, and they happened on Rank's watch with Rank's capital. What Rank failed to do was understand what it had purchased in terms that went beyond production volume and market share. The craft knowledge embedded in the idle workforce, the accumulated understanding of what a correctly assembled drive unit felt like, sounded like, and measured like knowledge held not in documents, but in the hands and ears of the people doing the work, was not an asset that appeared on any balance sheet. It was not, therefore, an asset that Rank's management logic was equipped to protect. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the competitive environment in the British loudspeaker market changed in ways that Rank's production economics were poorly positioned to absorb. Japanese manufacturers, Yamaha, Sony, and Pioneer among them, had by this period developed loudspeaker lines that offered measured performance broadly comparable to mid-range British products at retail prices that reflected Japanese production costs rather than West Yorkshire ones. The gap was not marginal. A Japanese bookshelf speaker offering similar frequency response measurements to a Wharfedale product of equivalent size could be landed in a British distributor's warehouse at a price that made direct competition at identical retail margins structurally difficult for any Bradford manufacturer to sustain. The British hi-fi trade press noticed. What Hi-Fi Choice and Hi-Fi Answers, the publications whose reviews drove purchasing decisions among the serious British domestic listener, began through the early 1980s to include Japanese loudspeakers in comparative tests where previously only British products had been considered. The results were not uniformly favorable to the Japanese manufacturers. British listeners and British reviewers consistently preferred certain qualities, a warmth in the mid-range, a particular kind of bass weight that the Yorkshire cabinet-making tradition produced, and that Japanese production methods of the period did not reliably replicate. But preference and purchasing behavior are not the same thing. At a sufficient price differential, preference gives way to arithmetic. Wharfedale's response was the diamond strategy: cost reduction through material substitution and cabinet miniaturization, producing a product competitive at the budget end of the market, where Japanese pressure was most acute. The strategy worked commercially. The diamond sold, but it repositioned Wharfedale from a company whose identity rested on the Linton and the Denton substantial, carefully crafted speakers that expressed a specific British philosophy of domestic sound reproduction to a company whose public identity was increasingly defined by a small, inexpensive, award-winning box. The heritage did not disappear. It receded. And in the loudspeaker trade, as in most craft-based industries, the distance between receding and gone is shorter than it appears from the outside. Rank, meanwhile, had arrived at a corporate conclusion that had nothing to do with loudspeakers. By the late 1980s, the Rank organization's strategic focus had shifted decisively toward its film leisure and reprographic businesses. The hi-fi division Wharfedale and the associated brands that Rank had accumulated over 3 decades was peripheral to that focus. Not loss-making, not embarrassing, simply peripheral. The language of corporate disposal is always the same: non-core assets, portfolio rationalization, strategic focus. What those phrases meant in practical terms was that the Bradford Road factory and the workforce it housed were about to become someone else's responsibility. In the early 1990s, Rank sold Wharfedale to the Verity Group plc. Verity already owned Quad Electroacoustics and H.J. Leake and Company, the 2 British hi-fi manufacturers whose stories this channel has already told. The 3 most significant names in post-war British domestic audio were now under common ownership for the first time. It was, depending on one's point of view, either a consolidation that might finally give British hi-fi the organizational strength to compete in a global market, or a gathering of assets by a conglomerate that had not yet decided what to do with them. The answer, when it came, would resolve that ambiguity completely, but it would take the discovery of a piece of military technology in a British government document by a Verity executive who was not looking for it to make the decision for them. The technology that ended Wharfedale's British manufacturing life had nothing to do with music. In the early 1990s, senior executives at the Verity Group came across a document from a British government agency describing research into noise cancellation technology developed for military helicopter cabins. The research concerned the behavior of flat, rigid panels when subjected to distributed mechanical excitation, a method of making an entire surface vibrate in a controlled pattern rather than driving a cone from a single point. Someone in the course of testing the equipment had tried playing music through it. The sound quality, by the account of those present, was startling. The panel had produced sound of a character quite different from anything a conventional cone and cabinet loudspeaker could achieve, diffuse, enveloping, apparently sourceless. Verity formed a new company to exploit the technology. It was called New Transducers Limited, subsequently known as NXT. The flat panel sound transducer, a rigid panel excited by small actuators attached to its surface, capable of producing sound from any flat surface, including walls, ceilings, and the lids of laptop computers, was positioned as the loudspeaker technology of the coming century. Investment was required. Substantial investment of the kind that could not be generated from the revenues of 3 heritage hi-fi brands whose combined market had been contracting for a decade. Verity's board made its decision with the directness that financial logic always produces when heritage is the item on the other side of the ledger. Wharfedale Quad and Leek, the 3 brands acquired across 2 decades of British hi-fi consolidation, would be sold. The proceeds would fund NXT's development. On the 19th of September 1997, a management buyout separated the 3 brands from Verity Group. On the same day, the International Audio Group IAG, a Hong Kong-based entity controlled by Bernard and Michael Chang, established in 1991, acquired all 3. The flat panel technology, as it turned out, found its most successful applications not in domestic hi-fi, but in laptop computer speakers, retail display screens, and public address installations. NXT did not replace the loudspeaker. The loudspeaker, as Gilbert Briggs had designed it in a cellar in Ilkley in 1932, a cone, a coil, a magnet, a cabinet, remained the dominant technology for serious music reproduction. The 3 brands sold to fund its replacement survived. The technology they were sold to fund did not fulfill its promise in the market Verity had envisaged. Under IAG, production moved to Shenzhen, China at the International Audio Group's manufacturing facility in the Pearl River Delta Special Economic Zone, one of the largest electronics manufacturing complexes in the world. The economics were not ambiguous. Chinese production costs for the components, cabinets, and assembly labor required to build a Wharfedale Diamond were a fraction of equivalent West Yorkshire costs. The Diamond series continued, the awards continued, the brand continued. What did not continue was the Bradford Road factory. The 170,000 square foot facility that had taken 7 years to build, that had produced 800,000 drive units in a single year at its peak, that had employed generations of workers from the same West Riding communities that had supplied the textile mills before them, that factory ceased Wharfedale production. The cabinet makers found other work or did not. The assemblers dispersed. The quality control inspectors who had spent careers learning what a correctly built Wharfedale drive unit felt like in the hand retired or moved on, taking with them knowledge that existed nowhere in any document and could not be recovered by any subsequent management decision. The Wharfedale name continued. The Bradford workforce did not. The Diamond continued to win awards. The Linton was discontinued. The Denton faded from the catalogue. The valley of the River Wharfe, which had given the brand its name, its character, and its specific way of building things, was no longer part of the production process in any meaningful sense. Idle Bradford is a suburb now absorbed into the Bradford Metropolitan District, its mill buildings variously converted, derelict or demolished. The Bradford Road facility that housed Wharfedale's peak production years did not survive intact. What stands there today bears no visible connection to the 800,000 drive units that once left it annually for living rooms across Britain and beyond. Gilbert Briggs had died on the 9th of January 1978, 19 years before the IAG acquisition, long before the Bradford Road factory reached the end of its Wharfedale production life. He had lived to see the Royal Festival Hall demonstration become a landmark in the history of recorded sound. He had lived to see his books sell 250,000 copies. He had lived to see the factory he started in a cellar in Ilkley grow to a scale he could not have imagined in 1932. He had not lived to see what happened after. When the last Wharfedale speaker left the Bradford Road factory, did anyone in the building understand what was ending? Not just a production run, but the last direct line from a cellar in Ilkley to the living rooms of Britain. The production targets had been met. The quality metrics had been satisfied. The paperwork was in order. But the thing that could not be transferred to Shenzhen by any document or any logistics arrangement was the same thing that had never appeared on any balance sheet: the specific, accumulated, irreplaceable knowledge of how to build a Wharfedale loudspeaker in the place where the standard had been set. That knowledge left Bradford with the workforce. It has not returned. The International Audio Group did not acquire Wharfedale in order to destroy it. That distinction, too, must be stated plainly. IAG is not a brand licensing operation, not a letterhead attached to a procurement contract, not a name rented to the highest offshore bidder. The company owns its manufacturing facility in Shenzhen outright. It makes at that facility more than 90% of the components in every product that leaves under its brand's names, including the screws. It employs Peter Como, one of the most experienced loudspeaker designers in Britain, as Director of Acoustic Design, a role he has held for more than 40 years, splitting his working life between Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire, where IAG maintains a research development and limited production facility, and Shenzhen, where the mass production takes place. The engineering decisions that determine what a Wharfedale loudspeaker sounds like are still made in significant part by a British engineer working from British acoustic principles in a British building. This is not nothing. It is also not Bradford. The distinction matters because the Wharfedale story in its current chapter is more complicated than the standard narrative of British brand hollowing allows. IAG has not simply attached the Wharfedale name to a commodity product and relied on heritage recognition to sell it. The Diamond series still in production, still winning awards. Still, the entry point through which most listeners first encounter the brand is a genuinely engineered product, designed with care and manufactured to consistent standards. What it is not is a British-made product. The cabinet, the drivers, the crossover components, the assembly, all of it happens in Shenzhen. The engineering intelligence behind it happens in Huntingdon and in Shenzhen simultaneously. The brand name comes from Ilkley. The loudspeaker comes from the Pearl River Delta. In 2023, IAG took a step that complicated the narrative further. The Dovedale, a large three-way floor-standing speaker positioned at the top of the Heritage series, named as all the great Wharfedale models have always been named for a Yorkshire valley, was built at the Huntingdon facility and released with the designation that no Wharfedale product had carried for many years made in Britain. In 2025, the Aston followed a limited edition stand-mount 500 pairs only hand-built at Huntingdon by Peter Como's team using a carbon fiber mid-bass driver and a cabinet constructed with constrained layer damping laminates. 500 pairs, against the 800,000 drive units that left Bradford Road annually. At the mid-1970s, peak 500 pairs is a footnote. Against the complete absence of British Wharfedale manufacture that preceded it, 500 pairs is something else, a signal however small that the connection between the brand and the place it came from has not been entirely abandoned. The secondary market has rendered its own verdict independently of any marketing decision IAG has made. Original Wharfedale Lintons from the 1960s and 1970s, the three-way stand mounts that defined the brand's domestic peak, appear regularly on eBay on Reverb and in the specialist vintage audio communities that gather on forums including Hi-Fi Wigwam, Vintage Audio UK, and the classifieds sections of What Hi-Fi Pairs. In good condition command prices that consistently exceed their original retail equivalents in real terms. The serious listener who wants the specific character of a 1970s Linton, the wide baffle dispersion, the paper cone's particular relationship with mid-range frequencies, the cabinet resonance tuned for a British living room rather than an anechoic measurement chamber, cannot obtain it from any current production. They obtain it from another listener who has kept theirs, or from an estate sale in a terrace house in the West Riding, or from a dealer in vintage British audio who knows what they are and prices them accordingly. The reason the original still matters is not sentimental. It is acoustic. A wide baffle loudspeaker, a speaker whose front panel is substantially broader than the narrower cabinets that became fashionable in the 1980s and 1990s, produces a particular kind of sound dispersion, even enveloping, filling a room from wall to wall rather than projecting a focused beam toward a listening position. The original Linton's cabinet was wide because Briggs had designed it for a living room, not a listening room for a space where people moved around, sat at different distances from the speakers, listened while doing other things. That design philosophy produced a specific acoustic character that no specification can fully capture and no narrow cabinet modern equivalent fully replicates. The listeners who seek out original Wharfedales are not pursuing nostalgia. They are pursuing a sound that the current production catalog, for reasons of cost and fashion, rather than engineering, no longer offers. Now for the surprise that the official history does not emphasize. Raymond Cook left Wharfedale in 1961 because the rank organization's acquisition had changed the company he had joined. He went to Maidstone and founded KEF. Within a decade, KEF had developed the drive unit technology that became the basis of the BBC LS 3/5A, the compact monitor loudspeaker that the BBC adopted as its reference standard for outside broadcast and location recording, and that became in consequence the most influential British loudspeaker of the 20th century. The BBC validation that Wharfedale's Royal Festival Hall demonstrations had sought the institutional endorsement from the organization whose technical standards defined British broadcast audio was achieved not by Wharfedale, but by the company founded by the engineer Wharfedale had trained and then lost. The talent that left Bradford Road in 1961 went on to build the speaker the BBC actually chose. The irony is complete, and it is entirely British in character, understated structural, and visible only to those who know where to look. What stands today at the addresses most closely associated with Wharfedale's British manufacturing life does not announce its history. Idle is a Bradford suburb. The Bradford Road facility that once housed 800,000 drive units a year has not preserved its connection to the brand that built it. Ilkley remains a prosperous market town on the River Wharfe, the town that gave the brand its name, whose valley runs east toward Bradford through the same limestone landscape it has always occupied. The cellar where Briggs built his first loudspeaker in 1932 is part of a domestic house. There is no plaque. There is no visitor center. There is nothing to indicate that the living rooms of Britain were changed in a specific and permanent way by what happened in that cellar. Wharfedale's story is not the story of a company that failed. It is the story of a standard set without capital, without formal training, without institutional support in a cellar in a textile valley in the worst economic decade of the 20th century, and of what Britain chose to do with that standard once it became valuable. The standard was not destroyed, it was transferred. First to Rank, who scaled it without fully understanding it, then to Verity, who sold it to fund a technology that turned out not to be the future, then to IAG, who manufactures it in Shenzhen and designs it in Huntingdon and releases it in limited quantities as Made in Britain, a designation that means something different from what it meant in 1954, when 3,000 people sat in the Royal Festival Hall and could not tell whether they were hearing a live orchestra or a loudspeaker built in West Yorkshire. What would Gilbert Briggs recognize in a modern Wharfedale diamond manufactured in the Pearl River Delta from polypropylene and MDF and shipped to a British retailer in a box bearing the name of a Yorkshire valley? The name, certainly. The pursuit of value at accessible price points. Yes, that too. The sound. That is the question the secondary market has already answered in the prices it places on a pair of original Lintons, in a sitting room in Harrogate, still positioned against the same wall where they were first set up in 1969, still driven by an amplifier of the period still producing on a Tuesday evening in November, with a record on the turntable and the curtains drawn against the dark, the wide, even unhurried sound of a loudspeaker that was designed for exactly this room, this distance, this quality of attention, paper cone, veneered cabinet, the river wharf 20 miles to the north, the cellar in Ilkley, the Bradford Radio Society competition, the Royal Festival Hall, the Carnegie Hall, the Bradford Road Factory, the workforce that will not be reassembled, all of it compressed somehow into the movement of a cone in a magnetic field in a living room in Yorkshire, still doing what Gilbert Briggs said it could do. If you have a pair of originals, you already know. If you have never heard one, find one. The story does not end in Shenzhen. It ends here. See you in the next one.